I walked into the Blackwood family mansion, expecting champagne and birthday cake, but instead found myself facing the most humiliating moment of my marriage. My sister-in-law Victoria's 35th birthday party was supposed to be a celebration, but it became the night I discovered that my husband Marcus had been telling his entire family I was nothing more than a gold-digging waitress who trapped him into marriage. What they didn't know was that I owned the very roof over their heads, and by the end of the evening, I was going to make sure they all understood exactly who held the real power in this family. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The crystal chandelier cast dancing shadows across the marble foyer of the Blackwood estate as I smoothed down my emerald silk dress and checked my reflection in the antique mirror. 26 years old and still nervous about family gatherings, even after 2 years of marriage to Marcus. The dress had cost more than most people made in a month, but I'd learned that appearances mattered to the Blackwood family. They valued expensive things, prestigious connections, and most importantly, the illusion of old money respectability. I should have felt confident walking into that party. After all, I held advanced degrees from Stanford in both business and law, spoke 4 languages fluently, and had built a successful consulting firm before I even met Marcus. But something about his family always made me feel like I was auditioning for a role I'd never quite mastered. They had a way of making me second-guess everything from my accent to my background, even though I'd grown up in Pacific Heights and attended the same elite schools as many of their friends. Marcus appeared at my elbow, looking devastatingly handsome in his tailored navy suit. At 32, he still had the easy charm that had first attracted me at a charity gala 2.5 years ago. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his smile practiced and warm, and he moved through social situations with the effortless confidence of someone who'd never doubted his place in the world. "Ready to face the firing squad?" he asked with a grin that didn't quite reach his eye. I forced a smile back. "Your family isn't that bad." "They're worse," he replied, but his tone was affectionate rather than critical. "But they're my family, so we endure them together." The word "together" should have been comforting, but something in his voice made it feel more like a warning. We walked through the sprawling house toward the sound of laughter and conversation echoing from the main drawing room. The Blackwood mansion in Hillsborough had been in the family for 3 generations, a testament to old California money built on shipping and real estate investment. Every room was decorated with museum-quality art and furniture that cost more than most people's homes. The party was already in full swing when we entered the drawing room. About 40 guests milled around, holding crystal glasses of champagne and engaging in the kind of polite conversation that the wealthy had perfected into an art form. I recognized most of the faces from previous family gatherings, charity events, and Marcus's business associate. They were all perfectly dressed, perfectly polished, and perfectly aware of their place in San Francisco's social hierarchy. Victoria spotted us immediately and glided over with the grace that came from years of finishing school and social training. At 35, she was still stunning, with the kind of effortless beauty that made every room she entered feel like her personal stage. Her blonde hair was swept into an elegant updo, and her champagne-colored dress probably cost more than a small car. She was everything the Blackwood family expected their women to be: beautiful, charming, and completely devoted to maintaining their social status. "Marcus, darling." She air-kissed both his cheeks before turning to me with a smile that never quite reached her eye. "And Sophia, how lovely that you could make it." There was something in her tone that made it sound like my attendance was optional rather than expected. Like I was a guest rather than family. But I smiled warmly and handed her the Cartier bracelet I'd selected as her birthday gift, a piece that had required a personal appointment at their Union Square boutique. "Happy birthday, Victoria. I hope your year ahead is everything you're hoping for." She accepted the gift with practiced grace, though I noticed she didn't open it immediately like she had with the other presents she'd received earlier. Instead, she set it aside with barely a glance, as if expensive jewelry from family members was so routine it didn't warrant immediate attention. "How thoughtful," she said in a tone that suggested the opposite. "You really shouldn't have gone to such trouble." Marcus's hand found the small of my back, a gesture that should have been supportive but felt more like a warning to behave myself. His mother, Eleanor Blackwood, approached us with the measured steps of someone who'd spent 70 years perfecting the art of social dominance. She was a formidable woman, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, who treated every interaction like a chess game she intended to win. "Sophia, dear," she said, her voice carrying the crisp diction of someone who'd attended Swiss finishing schools and married into San Francisco royalty. "How are you adjusting to married life? It must be quite different from what you're accustomed to." The comment was perfectly polite on the surface, but carried an undertone that suggested I came from circumstances far beneath their standard. I'd learned to navigate these subtle insults over the past 2 years, but they still stung, especially because I suspected Eleanor knew more about my background than she let on. "Marriage has been wonderful," I replied evenly. "Marcus and I complement each other beautifully." "Yes, I'm sure you appreciate the stability he provides," Eleanor continued with a smile that was all teeth and no warmth. "It must be reassuring after your previous circumstances." I felt my jaw tighten slightly but maintained my composure. Eleanor had a talent for making comments that could be interpreted as either complimentary or cutting, depending on the listener's perspective. It was a skill that came from decades of high society maneuvering, and she wielded it like a weapon. Marcus guided me away from his mother toward the bar, where his father Robert was holding court with several business associates. Robert Blackwood was a distinguished man in his mid-70s, with silver hair and the kind of presence that commanded attention in any room. He'd built the family's shipping business into a multi-million-dollar empire, and was used to being the most important person wherever he went. "Sophia," he boomed when he saw us approaching. "Come meet some friends of mine from the Pacific Union Club." He introduced me to a group of wealthy older men, who looked at me with the polite interest they might show a prized horse or an expensive painting. I could feel them assessing everything about me, from my dress to my posture to the way I spoke. These were men who were accustomed to evaluating assets, and I could tell they were trying to determine what category I fell into. "Sophia has quite an interesting background," Robert said, and something in his tone made my stomach clench. "She was working as a server when Marcus met her." Real Cinderella story. The words hit me like a physical blow. I hadn't been working as a server when I met Marcus. I'd been attending a charity gala where my consulting firm had donated services for the silent auction. But somehow in the 2 years since our marriage, the family had transformed my story into something more palatable to their narrative of Marcus rescuing me from poverty. "How charming," one of the men said with a condescending smile. "It's wonderful when successful men can lift others up through marriage." I felt heat creeping up my neck, but before I could correct the record, Marcus jumped in with a laugh that sounded forced. "Dad, you're embarrassing her. Sophia's much more accomplished than she lets on." But the damage was done. The men nodded knowingly, clearly believing they understood exactly what kind of woman I was, and why Marcus had married me. I excused myself to the powder room, needing a moment to collect myself before I said something I might regret. The powder room was a sanctuary of marble and gold fixtures, decorated with fresh orchids, and hand towels that were probably worth more than most people's monthly rent. I stared at my reflection, taking deep breaths, and trying to center myself. This wasn't the first time the Blackwood family had subtly undermined me, but tonight felt different, more deliberate, more cruel. When I returned to the party, I noticed that conversations seemed to quiet slightly as I passed, then resume in hushed tones after I'd moved on. Something was happening that I didn't understand, some undercurrent of tension that hadn't been there when I'd arrived. I found Marcus near the dessert table, deep in conversation with his cousin Bradley, a successful attorney who'd always treated me with cool professionalism. They were speaking in low voices, their heads close together in a way that suggested they were discussing something private. "Everything all right?" I asked as I approached. They both looked up quickly, their expressions shifting to forced casualness that immediately put me on guard. "Of course," Marcus said, but his smile was strained. "Bradley was just telling me about a case he's working on." "Fascinating stuff," Bradley added with the kind of enthusiasm that suggested he was lying. "Corporate law. Very dry." I nodded, but something about their body language told me they hadn't been discussing legal matters. There was an energy between them. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. A shared knowledge that they were careful not to let me see. It reminded me of the way people acted when they were planning a surprise party, except the surprise didn't feel like it would be pleasant. The evening continued with the usual birthday party ritual. Victoria opened her gifts with practiced enthusiasm, thanking each guest with perfectly calibrated gratitude. When she finally opened my Cartier bracelet, she held it up for everyone to see with a smile that looked genuine for the first time all evening. "How beautiful!" she exclaimed. "Sophia, this is absolutely stunning. You have exquisite taste." The compliment should have pleased me, but something about the way she said it felt wrong, like she was surprised I could afford something so expensive, or that I had the sophistication to choose well. There was an undertone of amazement that suggested she'd expected something far less impressive. "It's nothing," I replied modestly. "I just wanted you to have something special for your birthday." "It's hardly nothing," Eleanor interjected from across the room. "This must have cost quite a bit. I hope Marcus doesn't mind you spending his money so freely." The comment hung in the air like poison gas. Every conversation in the room seemed to pause as people turned to observe my reaction. I felt my cheeks burn with embarrassment and anger, but I kept my voice level when I responded. "Actually, I purchased it myself. I have my own income." "Of course you do, dear," Eleanor replied with a patronizing smile. "I'm sure Marcus makes sure you have enough for your personal expenses." The implication was clear. Any money I had access to came from Marcus, and therefore I was spending his resources rather than my own. It was a deliberate attempt to diminish me in front of their friends and associates, to reinforce the narrative that I was financially dependent on their family's generosity. I was about to respond when Marcus placed a warning hand on my arm. "Mother, Sophia works very hard. She's more than capable of making her own purchases." But his defense felt half-hearted, like he was going through the motions rather than genuinely supporting me. And I noticed he hadn't corrected his mother's assumption about where my money came from. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of polite conversation and barely concealed condescension. I smiled and nodded and played the role of the grateful wife who'd married above her station. But inside, I was seething with anger and hurt that ran deeper than anything I'd experienced in my marriage. It wasn't until we were driving home in Marcus's BMW that I finally let my composure crack. "What the hell was that about?" I asked, my voice tight with controlled fury. Marcus kept his eyes on the road, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. "What do you mean? Don't play dumb with me, Marcus. Your entire family spent the evening treating me like some kind of charity case. Your father told people I was a server when we met. Your mother implied I'm spending your money, and you just stood there and let it happen. They don't mean anything by it," he said quietly. "That's just how they are. They're protective of family money and suspicious of outsiders." "Outsider?" I turned in my seat to stare at him. "I'm your wife, Marcus. I've been part of this family for 2 years. When do I stop being an outsider?" He was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Maybe you never do." The words hit me like a slap. In that moment, I realized that Marcus had never truly defended me to his family. He'd never corrected their assumptions about my background or my capability. He'd allowed them to create a narrative about our relationship that diminished me and elevated him, and he'd been complicit in maintaining that fiction. When we got home to our Nob Hill penthouse, I went straight to the home office and locked the door. I needed space to think, to process what had happened and figure out how to respond. The office was my sanctuary, decorated with my diplomas and awards, filled with the documents and contracts that represented my real life's work. I sat at my desk and stared at the wall of achievements that the Blackwood family either didn't know about or chose to ignore. My Stanford degrees, my business certifications, the photographs of me with CEOs and politicians whose companies I'd helped navigate complex international deals. This was who I really was, not the diminished version of myself that I'd allowed to exist in their presence. My laptop chimed with an email notification, and I glanced at the screen to see a message from my business partner David Chen. He was checking in about a major acquisition deal we were finalizing, something that would net our consulting firm several $1 million in fees. It was the kind of success that should have made me feel proud and accomplished, but instead it just highlighted the absurdity of my situation. Here I was, a successful businesswoman who advised Fortune 500 companies on mergers and acquisitions, and my husband's family treated me like I was lucky to have married into their circle. They had no idea that my personal net worth exceeded most of theirs, or that I'd been supporting myself quite comfortably long before I met Marcus. But as I sat there in the dark, I began to realize that perhaps it was time they learned the truth. Not just about my background or my success, but about something much more significant. Something that would change their perception of power and control within their own family. I opened my laptop and navigated to a secure folder that contained documents I'd never shared with Marcus or his family. Documents that represented the real foundation of Blackwood family wealth, and the secret that would transform their understanding of who really held power in their precious dynasty. 3 years ago, when Robert Blackwood had been facing a severe cash flow crisis that threatened to bankrupt the family shipping business, he'd made a desperate deal to save everything. A deal that involved selling controlling interest in Blackwood Industries to a private investment firm. What he didn't know was that the investment firm was a subsidiary of my consulting company, and that I had personally orchestrated the acquisition through a series of shell companies and international holding entities. I owned 51% of Blackwood Industries. I owned the shipping business that had built their fortune. I owned the mansion where they'd humiliated me tonight. I owned the cars they drove, the art they collected, and the bank accounts they used to maintain their lifestyle. For 3 years I'd allowed them to believe they were still in control while I quietly managed their assets and protected their financial stability. I'd done it out of love for Marcus, wanting to preserve his family's dignity while ensuring their security. But tonight had shown me that my consideration had been wasted on people who saw kindness as weakness and generosity as evidence of inferiority. I pulled up the legal documents that proved my ownership and began planning how to reveal the truth. Not in anger or spite, but with the calculated precision that had made me successful in business. The Blackwood family was about to learn that the woman they'd dismissed as a gold-digging outsider was actually the person who controlled their entire world. But first, I needed to understand exactly how deep their deception went. If Marcus had been lying to his family about my background, what else had he been hiding? And more importantly, what did he really think about our marriage? I opened another secure folder and began reviewing financial records that painted a very different picture of our relationship than the one I'd believed. Bank statements showing that Marcus had been accessing accounts I'd given him permission to use for household expenses, but using the money for purposes I'd never approved. Credit card charges for expensive gifts and dinners, but not for hotel bills for romantic weekends, but during times when I'd been traveling for business. The pattern was clear and devastating. While I'd been building our financial security and protecting his family's assets, Marcus had been living a double life. The man who'd married me for love, or so I'd believed, had actually been using me as a financial safety net, while maintaining relationships that had nothing to do with our marriage. I felt sick as I scrolled through months of evidence that my husband had been systematically deceiving, not just about money but about the fundamental nature of our relationship. The humiliation at the party tonight hadn't been an isolated incident. It had been the natural result of a family that saw me as a convenient resource, rather than a valued member. My phone buzzed with a text message from Marcus, probably checking to see if I was still angry about the evening. I ignored it, and continued my investigation, following digital trails that revealed the scope of his deception. He'd been careful to cover his tracks, but not careful enough to fool someone with my level of financial expertise. By 3 in the morning, I had a complete picture of the betrayal. Marcus had been using my money to fund an affair with his business partner's wife, a woman named Vivian Sterling, who moved in the same social circles as his family. The hotel bills, restaurant charges, and jewelry purchases painted a clear picture of a relationship that had been going on for over a year. But more than that, I'd discovered that Marcus had been sharing intimate details of our marriage with his family, portraying me as financially dependent and socially climbing, while hiding the truth about my actual success and background. The narrative they'd constructed about our relationship wasn't just insulting, It was a deliberate lie designed to maintain their sense of superiority. I sat back in my chair, staring at the evidence spread across my laptop screen, and felt a cold calm settle over me. The hurt and anger were still there, but they were now tempered by something more powerful: determination. I'd spent 2 years trying to fit into their world, diminishing myself to make them comfortable, accepting their subtle insults, because I loved Marcus and wanted to belong. But love built on lies wasn't really love at all, and belonging to a family that required me to deny my own worth wasn't worth the effort I'd been investing. I opened a new document and began drafting a plan that would accomplish several goals simultaneously. First, I would reveal the truth about who really controlled the Blackwood family wealth. Second, I would expose Marcus's deception and infidelity. And third, I would reclaim my own identity and power in a way that would leave no doubt about who I really was. The plan would unfold over the next few weeks, carefully orchestrated to maximize impact while maintaining the legal and ethical standards that governed my professional life. I wouldn't destroy the Blackwood family out of spite, but I would make sure they understood the reality of their situation and treated me with the respect I deserved, or I would remove myself from their lives entirely, taking my resources and support with me. Either way, the woman who'd been humiliated at Victoria's birthday party was about to disappear forever. In her place would emerge someone who refused to apologize for her success or hide her accomplishments to make others comfortable. The Blackwood family was about to discover that their greatest asset had always been the person they'd treated as their most expendable member, and by the time I was finished, they would understand exactly how much power they'd given away through their arrogance and prejudice. I closed my laptop and headed to bed, but sleep eluded me as I refined the details of my plan. Tomorrow would begin a new chapter in my life, one where I stopped playing by other people's rules and started defining the terms of my own existence. The birthday party had been intended as a celebration, but it had become something far more significant, the catalyst for my transformation from victim to victor. And unlike the Blackwood family's version of events, this story would be built on truth rather than convenient fiction. Marcus was still asleep when I left the penthouse the next morning, heading to my office to begin implementing the first phase of my plan. I had calls to make, documents to prepare, and a family to educate about the reality of their circumstances. The woman they'd humiliated last night was gone. In her place was someone who knew exactly what she was worth and wasn't afraid to prove it. The morning sun streamed through my office windows on Montgomery Street as I sat across from David Chen, my business partner of 5 years and one of the few people who knew the full extent of my holding. David was brilliant, discreet, and completely trustworthy, qualities that had made our consulting firm one of the most successful in San Francisco. He studied the documents I'd spread across the conference table with the careful attention of someone who understood the implications of what he was seeing. "So let me make sure I understand this correctly," David said, adjusting his glasses as he reviewed the ownership paper. "You've been secretly supporting your husband's family business for 3 years. They have no idea you're their majority shareholder, and last night they publicly humiliated you by pretending you're some kind of fortune hunter." I nodded, sipping my coffee and watching David's expression shift from professional interest to personal outrage. He'd attended my wedding to Marcus, and had always been skeptical of how the Blackwood family treated me, but even he hadn't known the full scope of their ignorance. "The irony is almost poetic," he continued, shaking his head. "They're living off your money while calling you a gold digger. How have you kept this secret for so long?" "Carefully constructed shell companies, international holding entities, and a lot of legal paperwork that they never bothered to examine closely," I replied. Robert Blackwood was desperate when his shipping business started failing. He was facing bankruptcy, potential criminal charges for unpaid taxes, and the loss of everything his family had built over generations. When my investment firm offered to purchase controlling interest, he saw it as salvation rather than surrender. David picked up another document, this one showing the complex web of companies I'd used to obscure my ownership. Blackwood Industries is now a subsidiary of Pacific Maritime Holdings, which is owned by Golden Gate Investments, which is controlled by Chen Morrison Consulting Group. It's elegant in its complexity. "I learned from the best," I said with a slight smile. You taught me that sometimes the most powerful position is the one nobody sees coming. We spent the next hour reviewing the financial records that documented not just my ownership of Blackwood Industries, but the extent to which I'd been subsidizing the family's lifestyle. The mansion they lived in was owned by one of my shell companies and leased to them at below-market rates. The cars they drove were purchased through corporate accounts I controlled. Even the art collection they were so proud of had been acquired using loans secured against assets I owned. This is bigger than just family drama, David observed as he calculated the total value of my investments in their lives. You've essentially been their anonymous benefactor, while they've been treating you like a charity case. The psychological manipulation here is staggering. I felt a familiar anger rising as I remembered Eleanor's condescending comments about my spending Marcus's money. The woman had been living in a house I owned while insulting my financial independence. It would have been laughable if it weren't so personally devastating. There's more, I said, opening my laptop to show David the evidence of Marcus's affair. While I've been protecting his family's financial security, he's been using the money I've given him access to for romantic getaways with another woman. David's expression darkened as he reviewed the bank statements and credit card records. Sophia, this isn't just infidelity, this is financial fraud. He's been accessing accounts you designated for specific purposes and using the funds for unauthorized expenses. You could file criminal charges. I'm considering it, I replied. But first, I want to understand the full scope of what's been happening. If Marcus has been lying to me about this, what else has he been hiding? I pulled up another set of documents that had taken me most of the night to compile. I've been going through our joint accounts, our tax returns, and the financial records from our marriage. Marcus has been systematically moving money out of our shared assets and into accounts I don't have access to. Small amounts at first, but increasingly larger sums over the past year. David studied the transfer records with growing concern. He's building a nest egg separate from your marriage. This looks like someone preparing for divorce while trying to hide assets from their spouse. The possibility hadn't occurred to me until David voiced it, but the pattern was undeniable. Marcus had been slowly and carefully moving money away from our shared financial life while maintaining the appearance of a committed husband. Combined with his affair and his family's treatment of me, it painted a picture of a man who'd been planning his exit strategy while keeping me in the dark. How much has he moved? I asked. Though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. David spent several minutes with his calculator before providing a figure that made my stomach clench. Approximately $800,000 over the past 18 months. All transferred to accounts held by something called Blackwood Personal Holdings, which appears to be registered in the Cayman Islands. I stared at the number, trying to process the magnitude of the betrayal. Marcus had been stealing from our marriage while I'd been protecting his family's financial future. He'd been planning to leave me while allowing his relatives to treat me like a gold-digging outsider. The hypocrisy was breathtaking in its scope and cruelty. We need to freeze those accounts immediately, David said, already reaching for his phone. I have contacts in international banking who can help us trace the money and prevent further transfers. Wait, I said, holding up a hand. Before we take any legal action, I want to gather more evidence. If Marcus has been this calculating about hiding money, there might be other things he's concealing. I need to know everything before I decide how to proceed. David nodded, understanding my caution. What did you have in mind? I'd been thinking about this question since the early hours of the morning, and I'd developed a plan that would give me access to information Marcus thought was secure. His family treats me like I'm financially ignorant. Right? They assume I don't understand business or legal matters. I want to use that assumption against them. I explained my idea to David, who listened with growing appreciation for the strategy's elegance. If the Blackwood family believed I was naive about financial matters, they might be careless about what they discussed in my presence. And if Marcus thought I was too trusting to investigate his activities, he might not have been as careful about covering his tracks as he believed. It's risky, David warned. If they suspect you're investigating them, they could accelerate whatever timeline they're working on. You might lose the element of surprise. That's a chance I'm willing to take, I replied. I've spent 2 years trying to fit into their world on their terms. It's time for them to operate in mine. We spent the rest of the morning developing a comprehensive plan that would allow me to gather evidence while maintaining the appearance of the naive wife they expected me to be. David would use his connections to investigate Marcus's hidden accounts and trace the source of his affair fund. Meanwhile, I would position myself to observe and record the Blackwood family's private conversations about their finances and their plans for the future. The key to the strategy was information technology. David had contacts in corporate security who could provide surveillance equipment, sophisticated enough to capture conversations and data without being detected. If I could document the family's real attitudes toward me and their financial situation, I'd have evidence that would be devastating in either divorce proceedings or criminal charges. There's one more thing, I said as we prepared to leave the office. I want to schedule a family meeting to discuss financial planning, something that sounds innocent, but gives me an excuse to ask detailed questions about their assets and obligations. David smiled with genuine admiration. You're going to make them explain their financial situation to the person who actually owns everything. That's psychological warfare at its finest. The rest of the day was spent in preparation. David's security contacts provided me with recording devices, so small they were virtually undetectable, along with software that would allow me to monitor communications and financial transactions in real time. I felt like a spy preparing for a deep cover mission, except the target was my own family and the stakes were my entire future. That evening I returned to the penthouse with a carefully rehearsed plan. Marcus was in the living room, reading financial reports and sipping the expensive scotch I'd bought him for our last anniversary. He looked up when I entered, his expression cautious but hopeful. "How was your day?" he asked, setting down his paper. "Productive," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. "I've been thinking about what happened at Victoria's party, and I realize I may have overreacted." I watched his face carefully as I spoke, noting the relief that flashed across his features. He'd been expecting another confrontation about his family's behavior, and my apparent willingness to back down seemed to put him at ease. "I'm glad you feel that way," he said, standing to embrace me. "I know my family can be difficult sometimes, but they mean well. They're just protective of what we've built." The irony of his words was almost overwhelming, but I maintained my composure and returned his embrace. "I understand that now. I think I've been too sensitive about their comments. They don't know me well enough yet to appreciate what I bring to the family." Marcus pulled back to look at me, his eyes searching my face for signs of lingering anger. "You're an amazing woman, Sophia. My family will come to see that in time." "I hope so," I said with what I hoped was convincing sincerity. In fact, I was thinking it might be helpful if I understood more about the family's financial situation. If I'm going to be a real part of this family, I should probably know more about the business and our long-term plan. Something flickered in Marcus's expression, too quick for me to identify, but his smile remained warm. "That's a great idea. Dad would love to explain the shipping business to you. He's always enjoyed talking about the company's history. Could we set up a family meeting?" I asked. "Something where everyone could share their expertise and help me understand how I might contribute?" Marcus nodded enthusiastically, clearly pleased by what he interpreted as my desire to integrate more fully into his family's world. "I'll call Dad tomorrow and set something up. Maybe this weekend at the house." As we settled into our evening routine, I felt the strange disconnection of living a double life. On the surface, I was the loving wife trying to better understand her husband's family business. Underneath, I was gathering intelligence on people who'd been deceiving and manipulating me for years. The recording devices were already in place, capturing every word of our conversation for future analysis. Over the next few days, I threw myself into the role of the interested but naive family member. I asked Marcus innocent questions about his work, his family's history, and their financial plan. His answers revealed a complex web of assumptions and half-truths that painted a very different picture of their situation than the reality I knew. According to Marcus, his father had successfully navigated the shipping industry's recent challenges, through savvy investments and strategic partnerships. The family's wealth was secure, their assets diversified, and their future bright. He spoke with pride about their financial acumen and their ability to maintain their lifestyle even during economic downturns. What he didn't mention was that every successful investment had been funded by my money, every strategic partnership had been arranged through my business connections, and their current financial stability existed entirely because I'd prevented their bankruptcy 3 years earlier. The story he told was true in its outcomes, but completely false in its attribution of credit. More concerning were the casual comments he made about our own financial future. Marcus spoke about our marriage as if it were a temporary arrangement, mentioning plans that seemed to assume I wouldn't be part of his long-term picture. He talked about investments we might make, property we might purchase, and goals we might achieve, but the pronouns were always ambiguous, leaving room for interpretation about whether we included me. David's investigation was proceeding in parallel, and his daily reports were revealing the scope of Marcus's deception. The Cayman Islands accounts were just the beginning. Marcus had been establishing financial structures that would allow him to claim independence from our shared assets, while maintaining access to the money I'd contributed to our marriage. It was a sophisticated scheme that suggested he'd been planning this betrayal for much longer than I'd initially suspected. The surveillance equipment was providing equally disturbing insights into the Blackwood family's private conversation. When they thought I couldn't hear them, their discussions about me were poisonous in their casual cruelty. Eleanor referred to me as that girl Marcus picked up, and speculated about how much it would cost to make me disappear from their lives. Victoria complained about having to pretend to like me at family gatherings, and wondered when Marcus would come to his senses about our marriage. Most painful were the recordings of Marcus participating in these conversations. When his family criticized me, he didn't defend me. Instead, he laughed along with their jokes and contributed observations about my supposed character flaws. He described me as useful for now but acknowledged that I was probably not a long-term solution for his needs. The psychological impact of hearing these conversations was devastating, but they also provided me with exactly the ammunition I needed for what was coming next. The Blackwood family had revealed their true nature when they thought no one was listening, and their words would come back to haunt them. The family meeting was scheduled for Saturday afternoon at the Blackwood mansion, the same house where I'd been humiliated just a week earlier. This time, however, I would be entering with complete knowledge of the real power dynamics and a plan to shift them permanently in my favor. I spent Friday evening preparing my materials for the meeting, organizing documents and evidence in a way that would create maximum impact. David would be monitoring remotely, ready to implement financial and legal strategies based on how the family responded to my revelation. We'd also arranged for backup documentation to be held by our attorneys, ensuring that my evidence would be preserved regardless of how the Blackwood family chose to react. As I laid out my clothes for the meeting, I chose carefully. The black suit was perfectly tailored, expensive enough to signal success but conservative enough to avoid appearing threatening. I wanted to look like the successful businesswoman I actually was, not the diminished version of myself I'd been playing for their benefit. Saturday morning brought a text from Marcus confirming the meeting time and expressing his appreciation for my interest in learning about the family business. His enthusiasm was genuine, which made his ignorance even more striking. He had no idea that his wife already knew more about his family's financial situation than he did. I arrived at the Blackwood mansion exactly on time, carrying a leather portfolio that contained documents I'd carefully selected to tell the story I wanted them to hear. The same butler who'd served drinks at Victoria's party opened the door, his expression respectfully neutral as he led me to the library where the family had gathered. Robert Blackwood stood near the massive fireplace, looking every inch the successful patriarch in his perfectly pressed suit and polished shoes. Eleanor sat regally in a high-backed chair, her silver hair styled impeccably and her expression suggesting she was granting me an audience rather than welcoming a family member. Victoria lounged on the leather sofa with the casual confidence of someone who'd never doubted her place in the world, while Marcus stood near the window smiling with what appeared to be genuine pleasure at my arrival. "Sophie," Robert boomed, crossing the room to embrace me with the hearty affection he showed to business associates he wanted to impress. "Marcus tells me you're interested in learning about our little empire. How wonderful that you want to understand the family business." "I'm very eager to learn," I replied, settling into the chair they'd designated for me. "I realize I haven't been as engaged as I should be in understanding how the family's wealth is structured and managed." Eleanor's smile was patronizing as she responded, "How refreshing to see you taking an interest in these matters. Most young women find financial discussions terribly boring." I opened my portfolio and withdrew a legal pad, where I'd prepared questions that would guide the conversation in the direction I needed it to go. "I hope you don't mind if I take notes. There's so much I need to understand about shipping, real estate, and investment management." "Of course, dear," Robert said, clearly pleased by my apparent deference to his expertise. "Fire away with your question." For the next hour I listened as the Blackwood family explained their financial empire with the pride of people who believed they'd built something impressive through their own intelligence and hard work. Robert described the shipping business's evolution, Eleanor discussed their real estate holdings, and Victoria explained their art collection's investment value. Marcus provided commentary on their tax strategies and estate planning. Everything they told me was technically accurate, but the story they were telling omitted the most crucial detail. None of it would exist without my intervention and ongoing support. They were describing my assets as if they were family heirlooms passed down through generations of business acumen. "This is all fascinating," I said when they'd finished their presentations. "I had no idea the family's holdings were so extensive and well managed. You've clearly built something remarkable." "We have indeed," Robert replied with obvious satisfaction. "It takes skill and dedication to maintain wealth across generations. Not everyone has the vision to see opportunities and the courage to pursue them. I imagine it also takes substantial capital to make these investments," I observed innocently. "When you decided to expand the shipping business 3 years ago, where did the funding come from?" I watched their faces carefully as I asked the question, noting the slight tension that appeared in Robert's expression, and the way Eleanor's smile became more forced. "We had investors who recognized the potential," Robert said after a brief pause. "Strategic partners who understood the shipping industry and wanted to participate in our growth." "How wonderful that you found people willing to take that risk," I replied. "It must have been a substantial investment to save the company from the financial difficulties you were facing." The room grew noticeably quieter as the family processed my comment. I'd revealed knowledge of their crisis that they hadn't shared with me, knowledge that suggested I understood more about their situation than they'd assumed. "I'm not sure I understand what you mean by financial difficulties," Eleanor said carefully. I opened my portfolio again and withdrew a document that made Robert's face go pale. It was the original bankruptcy filing he'd prepared before my investment firm had contacted him, a document that detailed the company's desperate situation in stark financial terms. "I've been doing some research to better understand the family's history," I said with apparent innocence. "I found these public records that show Blackwood Industries was facing bankruptcy 3 years ago. The situation must have been terrifying for everyone involved." The silence in the room was deafening, as the family stared at the document that revealed their carefully hidden vulnerability. They'd constructed a narrative of continuous success and financial security, but I'd just produced evidence that their empire had nearly collapsed. "Where did you get that?" Robert asked, his voice tight with something between anger and fear. "Public records," I replied truthfully. "Bankruptcy filings are available through the court system to anyone who knows how to search for them." Marcus moved closer to look at the document, his expression shifting from confusion to alarm as he recognized the implications of what I'd discovered. "Dad, you never told me things were that bad." "They weren't," Robert said quickly, but his voice lacked conviction. "This was just a precautionary filing. We were exploring all our options." I withdrew another document from my portfolio, this one showing the investment agreement that had saved Blackwood Industries from bankruptcy. The filing was withdrawn after Pacific Maritime Holdings offered to purchase controlling interest in the company. That must have been an enormous relief. I watched as the family processed this information, their expressions shifting from confusion to suspicion to growing alarm, as they began to understand that I possessed detailed knowledge of their most closely guarded secret. "You seem to have done quite a bit of research," Eleanor observed, her voice carefully controlled. "I wanted to understand the family I married into." I replied. I hope you don't mind my curiosity about these matters. What I didn't tell them was that I was just getting started. The documents I'd revealed so far were merely the opening moves in a much larger game that would transform their understanding of power control and exactly who they'd been treating as an inferior member of their family. The real revelations were yet to come, and by the time I was finished, the Blackwood family would never again mistake me for someone they could manipulate or dismiss. The afternoon was about to become very educational for everyone involved, but especially for the people who'd spent the past 2 years underestimating the woman who actually controlled their entire world. The silence in the library stretched on as the Blackwood family absorbed the implications of what I'd just revealed. I could see their minds working, trying to understand how their carefully constructed narrative had been exposed by someone they'd dismissed as financially naive. Robert's hands trembled slightly as he reached for his brandy, while Eleanor's composed facade began showing hairline cracks of uncertainty. Sophia, Marcus said carefully, moving to stand behind my chair in what I recognized as a protective gesture that was actually an attempt to control the situation. I think there might be some misunderstanding about these documents. Business records can be complicated, and without proper context, they might give the wrong impression. I turned to look at him with the patient expression I'd perfected during 2 years of patronizing explanations. You're absolutely right, Marcus. Financial documents can be very confusing. That's why I brought someone to help clarify things. I pulled out my phone and sent a pre-arranged text message. Within moments, David Chen entered the library carrying a briefcase that I knew contained enough documentation to reconstruct the entire financial history of the Blackwood family's recent years. His presence immediately shifted the energy in the room from family discussion to formal business meeting. Everyone, I'd like you to meet David Chen, my business partner and financial advisor, I said, standing to make proper introduction. David has been helping me understand some of the more complex aspects of investment structures and corporate ownership. David set his briefcase on the antique coffee table and opened it with practiced efficiency. Good afternoon, everyone. Ms. Jameson asked me to help clarify some questions about corporate entities and investment relationships that have come up during her research. I watched the family's faces as they processed David's professional demeanor and the implications of my having brought financial expertise to what they'd assumed would be a casual education session. Robert's expression had shifted from paternal warmth to the guarded wariness of a businessman who sensed danger. I'm not sure this is necessary, Eleanor said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to controlling social situations. This is a family meeting, not a business consultation. Actually, Mrs. Blackwood, David replied with polite firmness, the matters we're discussing today involve both family and business relationships in ways that might surprise everyone present. He withdrew a thick folder from his briefcase and placed it on the table between us. Mrs. Jameson has asked me to help her understand the ownership structure of Blackwood Industries and the various entities that have provided financial support to the company over the past 3 years. Victoria sat forward in her chair, her socialite composure beginning to slip as she sensed that something significant was happening. What kind of entities? We've always been very transparent about our business relationships. David opened the folder and spread out several documents that I recognized as ownership charts, corporate filings, and financial flow diagrams. The papers covered the coffee table like pieces of a puzzle that, when assembled, would reveal the complete picture of how the Blackwood family's world actually operated. Let's start with the simplest question, David said, pointing to a corporate structure chart. Who owns Blackwood Industries? Robert straightened in his chair, clearly relieved to be dealing with a question he thought he could answer confidently. I do, of course. The company has been in my family for 3 generations. Actually, sir, that's not quite accurate according to these corporate filings, David replied, producing a document from the Securities and Exchange Commission. As of 3 years ago, Blackwood Industries became a wholly owned subsidiary of Pacific Maritime Holdings, which owns 100% of the company's stock. The color began draining from Robert's face as he stared at the official document. That's not possible. We have a partnership agreement, not a sale. I'm afraid the legal documents tell a different story, David continued, his tone remaining professionally neutral despite the bombshell he was delivering. The transaction was structured as a complete acquisition, with the previous owners retained as management under employment contracts. Marcus moved around the chair to look at the documents himself, his financial background allowing him to quickly understand what he was seeing. This shows that Dad sold the entire company, but that can't be right. We still live in the family house. We still run the business, under lease agreements and employment contracts provided by the new owners, David confirmed. Very generous terms, I should know. Below market rent for the property, executive salaries significantly above industry standards, and operational control maintained by the original management team. Eleanor's voice was barely controlled when she spoke. Who is Pacific Maritime Holding? What kind of company acquires family businesses and then allows the original owners to maintain their lifestyle? I felt a surge of satisfaction as David prepared to deliver the revelation that would transform their understanding of everything they thought they knew about their lives. Pacific Maritime Holdings is a subsidiary of Golden Gate Investments, which is controlled by Chen Morrison Consulting Group. The family stared at him in confusion, the corporate names meaning nothing to them yet. But I could see Marcus beginning to put the pieces together, his expression shifting from confusion to dawning realization as he remembered the name of my consulting firm. Chen Morrison, Marcus repeated slowly. That's your company, isn't it, Sophie? It is indeed, I replied, my voice calm and steady despite the magnitude of what I was revealing. David Chen and I founded the firm 5 years ago. We specialize in helping companies navigate complex financial situations. The silence that followed was deafening. I watched as each family member processed the implication of what they'd just learned, their faces cycling through disbelief, confusion, and growing horror as they understood the reality of their situation. You're saying, Victoria said slowly, that Sophia owns our company. Mrs. Jameson owns the majority controlling interest in Blackwood Industries. Yes, David confirmed. She also owns this house, your vehicles, and most of the assets you've been treating as family property. Robert stood abruptly, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. This is impossible. I would never have agreed to sell everything to some consulting firm I'd never heard of. Actually, you were quite grateful at the time, I said, opening my own folder to reveal the original correspondence between Robert and my investment team. Your company was facing bankruptcy, criminal tax charges, and the complete loss of everything your family had built. When my firm offered to acquire your debts and restructure your operations, you called it a miracle. I handed him the letter he'd written to my corporate representative, his own words expressing profound gratitude for the lifeline that had saved his family from financial ruin. You wrote that you would be forever in debt to the anonymous investor who had rescued Blackwood Industries from certain destruction. Marcus sank into a chair, his face pale as he stared at the documents scattered across the table. You've owned everything this whole time? While my family has been treating you like some kind of fortune hunter, you've actually been supporting all of us. For 3 years, I confirmed. I've been subsidizing your lifestyle, protecting your assets, and ensuring your family's financial security, while listening to lectures about not spending your money too freely. Eleanor's composure finally cracked completely. This is absurd. If you had this kind of wealth, why didn't you tell us? Why let us believe you were some kind of social climber? Because I wanted to be accepted for who I was, not what I owned, I replied. I hoped that over time, you would come to value me as a person rather than judge me based on assumptions about my background. I stood and walked to the window, looking out at the manicured gardens that I paid to maintain. But I've realized that acceptance based on deception isn't really acceptance at all, and respect that has to be purchased isn't really respect. David began laying out additional documents while I spoke, financial records that told the story of how extensively I'd been supporting the Blackwood family's life. The evidence was overwhelming and irrefutable, showing years of careful financial management that had preserved their dignity while ensuring their security. There's more, I said, turning back to face the family. Marcus, would you like to explain to everyone why you've been moving money from our joint accounts to hidden offshore holdings? The question hit him like a physical blow. Marcus's carefully maintained composure shattered as he realized I'd discovered his secret financial activity. Sophia, I can explain that. It's not what it looks like. It looks like you've been stealing from our marriage while planning to divorce me, I replied matter-of-fact. $800,000 moved to Cayman Islands accounts over the past 18 months, all while you've been having an affair with Vivian Sterling. Victoria gasped audibly, while Robert and Eleanor exchanged looks of shock and growing panic. They were beginning to understand that this wasn't just about corporate ownership, but about systematic deception that had infected every aspect of their family relationships. "How did you?" Marcus began, then stopped himself as he realized the futility of the question. If I'd been sophisticated enough to secretly acquire his family's business, I was certainly capable of uncovering his hidden financial activity. David produced another folder, this one containing surveillance evidence and financial records that documented Marcus's affair and the systematic way he'd been preparing to abandon our marriage while keeping my money. We have hotel receipts, restaurant charges, jewelry purchases and apartment lease agreements that paint a very clear picture of a parallel life funded by stolen marital assets. "You've been watching me?" Marcus asked, his voice tight with anger and fear. "I've been protecting my interests," I replied, something I should have started doing much sooner. I walked back to the table and picked up a legal document that David had prepared earlier in the week. "This is a petition for divorce on grounds of adultery and financial fraud. It includes request for full asset recovery, punitive damages, and criminal charges for theft of marital property." The document seemed to galvanize the family into action. Eleanor stood quickly, her social training allowing her to recover some composure even in crisis. "Surely we can discuss this reasonably. There's no need for lawyers and courts when family matters can be resolved privately." "I agree completely," I said, which seemed to surprise everyone in the room. "That's why I'm prepared to offer an alternative solution." I nodded to David, who produced a final set of documents from his briefcase. These papers represented the culmination of our planning over the past week, a comprehensive restructuring of the Blackwood family's entire financial situation. "I'm prepared to transfer ownership of Blackwood Industries back to Robert, along with the house and most of the assets I've been managing," I announced. "The company is profitable now, the debts have been cleared, and the operational systems are sound. You can resume control of your family business." The relief that washed over their faces was almost comical, but I wasn't finished with my proposal. "However," I continued, "there are conditions that must be met before this transfer can take place." Robert's expression grew cautious. "What kind of conditions?" "First, Marcus will return every penny he's stolen from our joint accounts, including interest and penalties. The offshore accounts will be liquidated, and the funds restored to our marital assets before any divorce proceedings begin." Marcus started to protest, but I held up a hand to silence him. "Second, the family will publicly acknowledge the true circumstances of our relationship. No more stories about me being a former server or a gold digger. You will correct the record with everyone you've shared those lies with, and you will do so publicly and completely." Eleanor's face flushed with embarrassment and anger. "You can't dictate what we say about family matters." "I can when those statements constitute defamation of character that has damaged my professional reputation," I replied calmly. "David has documented several instances where your false statements about my background have affected my business relationships." David nodded confirmation. "We have witnesses who can testify to hearing family members describe Mrs. Jameson in ways that are both false and damaging to her professional standing." "Third," I continued, "Marcus will sign a comprehensive prenuptial agreement if he wants to remain married, or he will agree to an equitable divorce settlement that reflects the actual financial contributions each of us has made to this marriage." I looked directly at Marcus as I delivered the final condition. "And fourth, your affair with Vivian Sterling ends immediately, with no further contact between you. If you choose to continue that relationship, you forfeit any claim to marital assets and face criminal prosecution for theft." The room fell silent as the family processed the terms I was offering. They were generous conditions considering what I could have demanded, but they also required the Blackwood family to abandon the narratives and behaviors that had defined their treatment of me for 2 years. Robert was the first to speak. "And if we agree to these conditions, you'll transfer everything back to us. Everything except what Marcus stole, which will remain part of our marital assets to be divided appropriately," I confirmed. "You'll have your company, your house and your independence. But you'll also have something you've never had before: complete honesty about how your family was saved from bankruptcy." Marcus stood and began pacing the room, clearly struggling with the decision he was being forced to make. "Sophia, I never meant for things to go this far. The affair, the money, it all just happened gradually." "No, Marcus," I replied firmly, "it was all planned and deliberate. you've been building a separate life while using my resources to fund it. That's not something that just happened. Victoria, who had been unusually quiet during the revelations, finally spoke up. Why are you offering to give everything back? If you own all of this, you could keep it. It was a fair question, and one I'd considered carefully during my plan, because I don't want to own something that was never really mine to begin with. Your father built this company, and it should belong to your family. I just want to be treated with the respect I've earned, not the condescension I've been receiving. Eleanor studied me with new eyes, perhaps seeing me clearly for the first time since I'd married into their family. You could have revealed all of this at any time over the past 3 years. You could have humiliated us just as thoroughly as we humiliated you. Why didn't you? Because I hoped it wouldn't be necessary, I said honestly. I believed that if I proved myself through my actions, if I contributed to the family's success and happiness, you would eventually accept me as I am. I looked around the room at each family member, seeing them struggle with the collision between their assumptions and reality. But Victoria's birthday party showed me that no amount of contribution or success would change how you see me. You need me to be smaller than I am in order to feel secure about your own worth. The truth of that statement seemed to hit home with surprising impact. Robert sat heavily in his chair, suddenly looking older than his 70-plus years. We've been living on your charity while treating you like a charity case. Yes, I replied simply, but charity given freely is a gift. Charity given under false pretenses is fraud. David began organizing the documents back into his briefcase, a signal that our presentation was complete, and it was time for the family to make their decision. Mrs. Jameson needs an answer today about how you'd like to proceed. The legal documents are prepared for either option: asset transfer or criminal prosecution. The finality of the deadline seemed to focus everyone's attention on the choice they were facing. They could accept my terms and rebuild their lives with dignity and tact, or they could refuse and face the full legal consequences of their deceptions and theft. Marcus was the first to break. I'll return the money, he said quietly, all of it, and I'll end things with Vivian. What about the marriage? I asked, knowing that the answer would determine whether this was a reconciliation or simply a civilized divorce. He looked at me with something that might have been genuine remorse for the first time since I'd met him. I don't know if I deserve a second chance after everything I've done, but if you're willing to try, I'd like to earn back your trust. It was a pretty speech, but I'd learned to be skeptical of Marcus's words when they weren't supported by his actions. We'll see, I replied non-committally. Trust is earned over time, not promised in moments of crisis. Robert stood and extended his hand to me with the formal dignity of a man conducting important business. Sophia, on behalf of my family, I accept your condition. We'll transfer the stolen funds, correct the false statements about your background, and treat you with the respect you should have received from the beginning. I shook his hand, feeling a complex mixture of satisfaction and sadness. This was victory, but it came at the cost of relationships that I'd hoped could be built on something more genuine than revealed power dynamics. Eleanor approached me with tears in her eyes, an emotional display I'd never seen from her before. I owe you an apology that I'm not sure how to give. We've been unconscionably cruel to someone who was protecting us. The apology I need isn't words, I replied gently. It's changed behavior going forward. Victoria was the last to speak, and her words surprised me with their directness. I've been jealous of you since the day Marcus brought you home. You're everything I wish I could be. Successful, independent, confident. I turned that jealousy into cruelty, and I'm ashamed of who I've been. It was perhaps the most honest thing anyone in the Blackwood family had ever said to me, and it gave me the first real hope that relationships might actually be rebuilt rather than simply renegotiated. Over the following weeks, the terms of our agreement were implemented with careful precision. Marcus liquidated the offshore accounts and returned every dollar he'd stolen, along with substantial penalties and interest. The family began the difficult process of publicly correcting the false stories they'd spread about my background, explaining to their social circle that I was actually a successful businesswoman who'd been supporting the family's enterprises. The reactions of their friends and associates ranged from shock to embarrassment, to grudging respect for the grace with which I'd handled the situation. Several business leaders who'd previously dismissed me based on the family's descriptions suddenly became very interested in my consulting services. David oversaw the transfer of assets back to the Blackwood family, a process that required months of legal documentation but ultimately restored their independence and dignity. They were once again the owners of their own lives, but now they understood the true cost of their previous arrogance and prejudice. Marcus moved out of our penthouse while we worked through marriage counseling, a process that would determine whether our relationship could be rebuilt on a foundation of honesty rather than deception. The work was difficult and painful, requiring both of us to confront uncomfortable truths about how we'd contributed to the dysfunction in our marriage. 6 months after that confrontational family meeting, I received an invitation that symbolized how much had changed in the Blackwood family's understanding of who I really was. Victoria was hosting a charity gala to benefit elder care services, and she'd asked me to serve as the keynote speaker about successful women in business. Standing at the podium in the same mansion where I'd been humiliated, less than a year earlier, I looked out at an audience that included everyone who'd witnessed my transformation from dismissed outsider to respected family member. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was being celebrated in the very room where I'd been systematically undermined. Success in business, I told the audience, isn't just about accumulating wealth or achieving recognition. It's about using your resources and abilities to create positive change in the world around you. I caught Marcus's eye in the audience, seeing something that looked like genuine admiration rather than the calculating assessment I'd grown accustomed to during our marriage. We were still working on rebuilding trust, but progress was being made. Sometimes the greatest success comes not from what you're able to acquire but from what you're willing to give up in order to maintain your integrity and self-respect. Eleanor nodded from her front row seat, her expression reflecting the hard-won wisdom that had come from confronting her own prejudices and assumptions. The woman who'd once questioned my right to spend money I'd earned was now one of my most vocal supporters in both business and charity. And sometimes, I concluded, the people who seem to have the least power are actually the ones who hold the greatest ability to transform the world around them. Never underestimate anyone based on appearances or assumptions. You might discover that the person you've been overlooking is actually the person you most need to learn from. The applause was warm and genuine, a far cry from the polite tolerance I'd experienced at previous Blackwood family gatherings. As I stepped down from the podium, I was surrounded by people who wanted to congratulate me, ask for business advice and learn more about my consulting services. Robert approached me with a smile that contained no trace of the condescension that had once characterized his interactions with me. "That was beautifully said, Sophia. You've built something remarkable, and I'm grateful that our family has had the opportunity to be part of your success." It was gracious acknowledgement of how our relationship had evolved, and it represented the kind of respect I'd been seeking since the day I'd married into their family. Not because of what I owned or controlled, but because of who I was and what I'd accomplished through my own effort. Later that evening, as the gala wound down and guests began departing, I found myself alone with Marcus on the mansion's terrace. The same garden where I'd once felt like an outsider was now illuminated by lights I'd helped choose and maintained by staff whose salaries I'd contributed to for years. "Do you think we can really rebuild this?" Marcus asked, his voice carrying a vulnerability I'd rarely heard from him. "I don't know," I replied honestly, "but I think we both deserve the chance to find out who we could be together if we're actually honest about who we are individually." He nodded, understanding that the work of rebuilding trust would be measured in years rather than months. "I'm grateful you're willing to try. I'm grateful you're finally willing to see me clearly," I replied. As we stood together in the garden of the house I'd secretly owned for 3 years, I reflected on the strange journey that had brought us to this point. The woman who'd been humiliated at a birthday party had discovered that she possessed far more power than anyone had realized, including herself. But more importantly, she'd learned that real power came not from what you could control but from how you chose to use your influence to create positive change. The Blackwood family would never again mistake kindness for weakness or generosity for desperation. They'd learned that the person they'd underestimated was actually the person who'd been protecting them all along. And perhaps most importantly, they'd discovered that true wealth wasn't measured in dollars or assets, but in the quality of relationships built on mutual respect and genuine understanding. The humiliation at Victoria's birthday party had been painful,
but it had also been necessary. Sometimes people need to see the full scope of their mistakes before they can begin to make better choices. The Blackwood family had seen the consequences of their prejudice and arrogance, and they'd chosen to change rather than continue down a path that would have destroyed them. As for me, I'd reclaimed not just my financial independence, but my sense of self-worth. I would never again diminish myself to make others comfortable, and I would never again accept treatment that didn't reflect my true value. The woman who'd walked into that mansion expecting cake and champagne had discovered something far more valuable: the strength to demand the respect she deserved and the wisdom to use her power in service of justice, rather than revenge. And in the end, that transformation had been worth more than all the money in the world. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.